Headquarters company of the 56th Armored Infantry Battalion. In the local paper, it's known as the 56th Artillery Infantry Battalion.
Oh, no.
Did you see the paper this morning?
No.
So they quoted some fellow as being the 56th Artillery. I guess I'm in the 66th AIB, so the reporter called it the 66th Artillery Infantry Battalion. Yeah.
Oh, well. Guess it can be changed later, huh?
I guess so. Show me a news report that is 100% accurate, and I'll show you a news report that doesn't exist.
Exactly. Exactly. Yep. I think everybody got to realize that at one point.
Yeah.
Okay. Can you understand me correct? Okay.
I can understand you clearly. Thank you.
Good. Just to let you know, we're just having a conversation. Okay? It's just you and me.
Right.
Larry's a good guy, but he's not here.
Okay.
Okay? And the camera's not
The
here.
invisible man.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay? So we'll go ahead and get started. Did you have any questions for me before we get started?
No, if you missed anything, I have several things. I think I mentioned them to you the other day. I saw Hitler once, and that's a very interesting story because it was 1935 and we were given special privileges by the Nazis because we were an American group. And I don't want to forget I think I saw the Dresden raid. You may have had other people remark on that, maybe not, but we were in a field about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and I don't know whether it was 1,000 or 1,500 airplanes went over, but I was lucky. I was out in the field, and I lay down on my back. We heard them coming, and they were going somewhere, and I believe it might have been I don't have no way of knowing. May have been the Dresden raid, which was a horrible, and I don't know if they were British planes or our planes or a combination of everything. But I lay down on the field and I had complete view, and from there to there, from there to there was nothing but B-17s just floating along. They weren't 18,000 feet up or anything like the planes today. They were maybe 1,000, 1,500 feet, just going along, and I said, no one will ever see a thing like this again. And it was a very, so I'd like to bring that up if I forget it.
Okay.
Oh, and then there's another incident after the war where I saw a desecrated Jewish cemetery, which was turned into a junkyard by the locals. And it's an interesting story because I was looking for a dead relative at the time. Was in a way in an off-road. I'm sure they would have cleaned it up if they'd had time, but it was right after the war, and my aunt wrote me and said my cousin's name was Carlos Brown, a distant cousin, but cousin. And Carlos had been shot down over Frankfurt, Germany, and my aunt wrote and told me that they hadn't found his body. And of course, we'd been in Germany and all the way deep into it by the end of the war, and this was probably in late May, early June. No, it was earlier than that because we still were allowed to carry our guns loaded. Very soon after the war, we had to. It was a safe thing to do, get rid of them. But anyway, I got permission from the commanding officer, and I took off to this town. I think it was Murnau, M-U-R-N-A-U, south of Dresden, of Frankfurt. And I went in there all alone, little old private with my old little carbine, and asked for the Burgermeister, and some guy came up. Well, I'm Burgermeister. Speak English? No, I get somebody to speak English. And there was a reporter from the Frankfurt Zeitung, that was the name of the Frankfurt paper, and naturally there was no food in Frankfurt because the war had just ended and Germany was devastated, and he had come to evidently his old family home where they had potatoes in the basement and a few eggs every other time the chicken chose to lay one, and the Americans chose not to take it. But the truth. But I said, do you have any people buried around here? And he said, oh, there's 3 or 5 guys that we found bodies during the war. They're out behind the barn. So we went out there, and I saw their graves. I said, you got anyone around here who I had known Carlos and knew what he looked like and so forth. And he was in the RCAF, Royal Canadian Air Force. He wasn't in the American Air Force. So, make a long story short, the guy rounded up somebody who had been there when these guys were buried. And I said, what did this guy look like? What did this guy look like? And I said, no, none of them could be Carlos. And if it were, Graves registration would have caught it later, but I didn't know all the intricacies of what happened after the war. This was just impetuous. And so I was about to leave, and we had become quite friendly. You know, the man spoke very good English, and he was evidently well-educated or something. So he said, you know, there's a little village 2 kilometers over here where there's a couple of more bodies. I know, so you know, they just buried them and so forth. So I said, well, I've got nothing else to do. Let's go over. So we're walking out of this one town over to the other, and on the right there, I noticed a cemetery, and as we got nearer and nearer to it, I realized that with the Star of David smashed and all over the place, and that it had been a Jewish cemetery, and they were using it as a dump. And I got very angry, and the friendship with this guy dissolved into nothingness, and I asked him, who did that? And he said, Hitler. And I won't give you the language I told him. I told him Hitler has never been in that damn place, and it was ridiculous. But we went over, finished the job, and I had no more conversation with that man. And I was very angry. But I thought that was an interesting, small tidbit about what went on in 1940. And there were a million stories like it, I'm sure. But as long as I might as well get the Hitler thing out of the way before we get to the 12th Armored thing. In 1935, my mother died when I was born in 1922, and my father died in 1930, right after the crash. But he had left enough money for his 2 surviving sons. One son died while he was at Princeton. My brother was 14 years older than I was, and he died at Princeton of pneumonia, having had a very severe attack of infantile paralysis. Older people today don't realize infantile paralysis was a murderous disease up until about 1946, I think. They had a thing called the March of Dimes. Have you ever heard of the March of Dimes? Well, it's still going, but it's for something else. But it was started to conquer infantile. But at any rate, when my father died, he left enough money for us to be educated if it was done carefully. We couldn't squander the money, let's put it like that. And my uncle found out that if he got us over to England, he could get a top-rate education in England for a better dollar. And then on top of that, you'd be getting the education of all this during the Depression, mind you. So my brother went over in 30, was there for 3 years, and I went over in 36 and stayed for 4 years at a school on the Thames right near Windsor Castle. And but that isn't the story. Jesus. The story is that in 1935, the year before I went to England, he found out that for $125, or was it $225? It was either $125 or $225. I could get on a boat in New York called the SS Deutschland of the Hamburg American Line, go to the port of Berlin, I've forgotten what it was, get off, go to Berlin, go to Weimar, go to Munich, go over to Mainz, get on the boat, go up the Rhine to Cologne, get off at Cologne, go over to Amsterdam, go from Amsterdam to Brussels, where they were having the 1935 exposition, which was one level below a World's Fair. And then we went from Brussels to Ostend, Ostend to Dover, Dover to London, London to Oxford, Oxford on Avon, back and then down to Southampton, where we got, that's about 6 weeks later, where we got on the SS Deutschland, the same boat, which I've forgotten how many tons it was. Probably it could carry 300 or 400 people. It wasn't like the Queen Mary or the big boats, but it was a big boat. And back to New York, all for $225, all meals included. All meals included. And there were 21 people in our group, and of the 21 people, I was the youngest. I was 13 and a half, and the next youngest was 16, and most of them were college kids. And outside of the one person who ran the whole thing, even the other helpers were the thing. But at any rate, when we went into Weimar, we stayed in youth hostels, which meant they gave you a straw thing to sleep on, and you had to bring your own mattress cover. You had to bring your own mattress cover, and it was very crude. But young people, it was marvelous. But at any rate, we were supposed to. I think Goethe was born in. I've forgotten who it was. I think it was Goethe. And anyway, we were supposed to go to his house. So we got up at the usual 7 or daybreak, and we had our breakfast. We all gathered, and of course, we weren't taking cabs into town at that rate. We walked it, and we were way on the outskirts of town. So we're walking into town, and everywhere you looked, there were people walking into town. What the heck's going on? This is ridiculous. And so our group knew how to speak German. I didn't. What's going on? And well, we're going to go and see Hitler. Who's Hitler? He'd only been the leader of Germany for 2 years at the time. I'd never heard of him. And so they took a vote, and they didn't even bother to ask me, probably. But at any rate, the vote was, let's go see this guy, instead of going to Goethe's house. You know, you've been to one house. Well, after we were at the Stratford-on-Avon, you go to one of those places, and then after about 6 weeks, they all just blend into one mishmash. But so we got down into the Weimar there, and the streets were jammed. I mean, there were thousands of people there. I don't know how Weimar's a city, but not a very big one, I don't think. And it was the home of the Weimar Republic, which was the democracy set up that didn't last after World War I. And so we all got into line, on the curb. And there were 20 of us in the group, and we just all formed around and waited. About an hour or an hour and a half went by. We didn't know when this guy was going to come, and he was just going to whiz by, but everybody wanted to see Hitler. And so by and by, about 5 or 6 guys, all brown shirts, black shirts, green shirts with swastikas on, came down, and some guy came up, "You guys American?" "Yeah, we're American." "Come." So they take us out of the line, and they march us right up to the front of the line, and they go, you. These people have probably been there since the day before. You. They kicked them out, and they said, "You guys go in here." And we sat there, and then we turned around, and we were right in front of the hotel, which was called the Elephant Hotel. And the reason I remember it had 2 pillars and 2 little elephants on top of the pillars. And it's actually the Elephantine Hotel, because I went to my travel agency about 15, 20 years ago. And I said, is there an elephant hotel in Weimar? It's still there. It's the Elephantine, but it was elephant in German, or however they spelled it. So then they come and they say, "You guys don't have to stand in line here. Walk around, stretch your legs, take it." And they had all of the escort cars with all of the escort guards, all their swords and daggers and swastikas all there. I walk up and down, look at all the latest, these are Duesenbergs, and these are not little T-Fords or anything. And so they were spiffy cars. And then by and by, they said, time to get in line, and I was the youngest in the front. I was right up in front, and we could see down about 30 yards, 40 yards or less. The porch of the hotel faced the driveway, and they had lined up some what looked to us like Boy Scouts. Of course, they were Hitler Youth. And then this guy comes out. He goes and he pats them on the head, and they move back, and he gets into the car, and he came right out at us, and then he was about a little further than, say that wall over there when they turned around. and it was about 11:30 in the morning by this time, late sleeper, and he looked like he had a hangover, and he wasn't standing up like that. He was in his car, and he had it like this. He looked like and psst, he went away. And that afternoon, I went to a Laurel and Hardy movie in Weimar. And I was the only one that laughed in the theater, as I recall, because they didn't know what was going on. That's the story. That's well, it will be good for history. I mean, this is what this is all about. Now, what would you like to ask me in our little conversation? It's a wide-ranging crossfire.
I'll bet he's the only person in the 12th Army to ever have seen Hitler.
I bet that's the case too. Yep. Yep, that's pretty cool.
I don't know. Oh, who else have I seen? Eisenhower was at my graduation from college. He was a speaker at Pennsylvania, U of P. And I've seen 2 or 3 kings. I saw this present Queen of England when she was a little girl, because our school was at Windsor, and I was there for 4 years. And we used to run through Windsor Great Park, which is the park that's attached to Windsor Castle. Windsor Castle, and then they have this big public park, but it's owned by the Crown, but it's public. And if you ever seen that movie, forgotten what it was called, but there's this big long walk leading from Windsor Castle to the statue of a king on a horse at the other end. And the story, we used to, when we'd go on our cross-country runs, we'd run from the school around that horse and go back to school. That's how close we were. And that particular horse, if you ever go there, notice that the figure has no stirrups on the horse. And the story is that when the artist, when the thing was unveiled, everybody gasped because he had not, the rider was on this fancy, big, magnificent horse, all armored up and everything. And he went out and committed suicide because he had failed to that's the story. I don't know if it's true. Now, shall I shut up?
Well, just for a minute, I just wanted to introduce you to the tape to begin with. We are here at the 12th Armored Division Memorial Museum in Abilene, Texas.
Right.
This is the 55th annual reunion, and it is October 6th, 2001. This is Phillip Clarke. He is with the headquarters of the
Company.
56th company of the 56th AIB.
Right.
My name is Michelle Colvin.
Michelle, it's a pleasure.
So,
Who's the invisible man?
this is Larry Bradshaw.
Larry, it's a pleasure.
Thank you.
So, why don't we just get started with the way you were, where you were born and where you were raised?
Okay. I had an unusual thing. My mother died when I was born, and my father and my brother had a chain of stores totaling 23 stores in the Lackawanna, Wyoming Valley of northeastern Pennsylvania. It's called, near Scranton. I was born in Scranton, PA, in a house. I was not born in a hospital. I was born in a house. And my mother died the week after I was born. I don't know what of. I never asked, and leave that alone. And I had 3 brothers, 2 of whom were 14 and 15 years older than I, and 1 of whom was 7 years older than I. So the 2 came rather fast, about '05, '06, or whenever. And Ted was born, I think, in 15. Yeah, 15, and I was born in 22, on Lincoln's birthday, February 12th, 1922. The people in the future have to look that up because they don't teach that stuff anymore, unfortunately. But at any rate, my father, let's see, our name was Clarke, and he and his brother built the stores up and broke them down. And it was a very hasty thing in the sense that my grandfather left Ballygar, Ireland, when he was 19 years old, in 37, 47. In 1856, he left Ballygar Island, came to the United States, went to Carbondale, Pennsylvania, with two cousins named Breheny, B-R-E-H-N-E-Y, and I don't know how you pronounce it. But anyway, when the two Breheny brothers decided to become Catholic priests, they went somewhere to become Catholic, to a seminary to become Catholic priests. And my grandfather migrated down to an area north of Scranton called Hyde Park. But of course now it's just a section of Scranton, and I don't even know if it's called Hyde Park. But at any rate, he decided to open up a grocery store in his living room. So he opened up a grocery store in his living room, and his two sons, Edward Clarke and George Walter Clarke, my father, inherited this store about 1890 or 1885, somewhere. Well, my father was born in 75, 85, 95. Had to be 94, 93. They inherited this store, and by dint of hard work, they went and they opened up 21 stores they had going at one time, and a large grocery chain offered to buy it for $2 million at that time. No taxes, nothing. But they wouldn't sell. But at any rate, they went downhill. This chain store said, "Well, you won't sell us. We'll go in anyway." And they didn't have the modern apparatus. They only had two chiefs, and everybody else was an Indian, and they didn't just delegate authority and pay for it. If you delegate, you got to pay for it. So they didn't. It went by World War I was the first thing that killed them, because they loaded up with a lot of cheap stuff when the war started, because goods started to get scarce. And it was a relatively short war, because it lasted about 18 months or something. And they got stuck with a lot of shoddy merchandise that cost them a penny. Then Uncle Ed became totally incapacitated about 1919 or 1920. And by that time, most of the little stores were gone. And in 1925, they had the major department store, a very large store in Scranton, and it burned to the ground. And I believe most of it was mortgaged to the hilt. But my father did have some money, and he did leave enough, as I said earlier, for my old Dick, the one who wasn't and didn't die, and he wasn't. He was on Wall Street, working on Wall Street when the crash came, and he was worth $125,000 on paper, and he got completely wiped out in 3 days or 4 days or something. He was just a kid, but he had been a runner to move paper from place to place, and he was a young man. And my Uncle Phil his name was Philip Rodriguez, and my mother's name was Mercedes Rodriguez. And her mother's name was Catherine Dolan. So I'm 3/4 Irish and 1/4 Spanish. The Rodriguez is the Spanish, and the Dolan is the, Dolan made my mother 50-50. She was half Spanish and half, and so forth. But at any rate, my brother Dick had a hell of a time during the Depression. It was murder. He ran a pick through his foot on one occasion and was in the hospital for months. And on another occasion, he was working in a brewery, and they sent him in to clean the vat down before the fumes had been completely made it safe. And fortunately, he had a companion with him who went in and pulled him out. And he was not thing. But then he ended up getting a job at the Bethlehem Steel Corporation. But he was incapacitated. He was hurt by infantile paralysis because one foot was shorter than the other, and he was a burly man, much bigger than I am, and he walked with a swagger to cover his feet, 1 foot being shorter than the other. He was quite a guy. But at any rate, my Uncle Phil was a banker in New York who incidentally was the investment advisor to David Dubinsky of the International Lady Garment Workers Union. That's a very famous name in the 1930s and early 40s. the International Lady Garment Workers were one of the stronger unions in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and probably still today. But at any rate, my Uncle Phil got wiped out by the crash too. Everything he had went up in flames. He was worth $500,000, and he lost it all. But he had his on margin, I think, or something. And not only did he lose it, but he owed money. And he was quite a man. He refused to file for bankruptcy, and he spent the rest of his life paying it off. And he lived in New York City in hotels, a little hotel room with a fancy address. And my Army record showed that I lived at 52 Gramercy Park North, which happened to be the Hotel Gramercy Park, and I've never slept there. But he was my guardian, and I used, "Where do you live, soldier?" 52 Gramercy Park North. I don't know. I didn't live anywhere, but I was always going to camp or going to school or going hither, thither, and yon. And where he lived was my address. So, at any rate, I got a good education. I went to public school 1 year, and then I was sent to a school at the door to West Point. There's a Thayer Gate. Colonel Thayer founded West Point in 18 blue, whatever it was. And there's a Thayer Hotel right at the Thayer Gate, and it's the gate that lets out onto the nearby town of Highland Falls, New York. And in Highland Falls, New York, they had a girls' college named Lady Cliff College for girls, which was run by Franciscan nuns. And I guess somewhere along, probably during the Depression, I don't know how, they went and slapped a boys' academy, so-called academy, grades 1 through 8, and called it Lady Cliff Academy. And so I went there in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grades. My father sent me there, and then he died, and Uncle Phil left me there for a year or two, and then I transferred. We wore West Point uniforms in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade, and 2 or 3 times a week a cadet would come over from West Point and drill us. And this is 2nd, 3rd, and 4th grade. Squads right, squads left. That was the old World War I formations they would teach us, which we didn't use in World War II. And then I was sent to a school in Philadelphia, out in Chestnut Hill, which is a section of Philadelphia, because I had an aunt who lived in Mount Airy, which was right between Germantown and Chestnut Hill on Germantown Avenue, all in the city of Philadelphia. And I was there till the 8th grade. Then I was sent to the school a Catholic school in England called Beaumont College. And incidentally, while I was at Beaumont College, the prep school for Beaumont College, it was a high school. Eton College is a high school. It's not a university or a college in the way we think in this country. And Beaumont College was a Jesuit school, and they had a prep school called St. John's Beaumont. And while I was at Beaumont College, William F. Buckley Jr. was at the. Is there any way to censor this next thing? You can tell this 50 years from now. I don't want to tell it, but I don't want to tell this little. It's not anything, but I do it. But when I have the highest admiration for the guy, and in fact, he's a giant in political history in the 20th century of America, a giant, and there's no getting away from it. but I told him this once. He doesn't know me from Adam, but I bumped into him once. He was not amused. I'm at Beaumont, and we're in high school, and we're talking about a kid in grade school, and Buckley was only there for 1 year, and he wasn't there for the full year because it must have been 1938, and in August of '38 they had the big scare, the first big scare before the war started in '39, and I think his dad yanked him out. He had 3 or 4 kids over there, and in England in various schools, and he yanked them all. and took himself and all and went back to the U.S. But at any rate, I'm walking along the corridor at Beaumont one day, and this Jesuit priest stops me and says, "Clarke." "Yes, Father?" He says, "What's the matter with you Americans?" And I said, "What do you mean, Father?" He says, "They've got a boy over at St. John's trying to tell him how to run the university." No, not the university, tell him how to run the place. I said, "Well, don't look at me. I'm not telling you how to run anything." And that's a true story about Buckley. He was at a political picnic in upstate New York one time when I went to this. I helped form the Conservative Party of the state of New York. I'm a very conservative person. And I walked up to him and told him that, and he was not amused. He was not amused. I'm sorry.
No, don't apologize.
Yeah, but this is all, I know this is, but that little section there I would like to put in a little slot. And 25, 50 years ago, who cares, but it's amusing.
That's great. How did you...
That was, and then before I came back from England on the last American, I was at Beaumont through Dunkirk. In other words, when the British Army was wiped out of the continent and they came back, one of the guys killed at Dunkirk had been at school with me 3 or 5 months before he was killed. He was an older boy, and he had been called up. I don't know what. He was killed at Dunkirk, and one day I'm walking down the thing, and the Jesuit called me, "Clarke, he said, here's a telegram for you." And the telegram read, "Passage has been booked for you on the SS Washington leaving Galway July 2nd, 1940. Be sure to get a British exit permit." I had in addition to your passport, you needed. I went, and then I arranged with the Jesuits. I left school immediately. I didn't get my certificate A, which is what the equivalent of a diploma for high school. I left. It was my final year there. I'd gone 36 to 40, and I left London in a blackout. This was about 5 to 7 weeks before they started bombing London, and went over to Wales. Went from Wales to Dublin, Dublin over to Galway, and it took me 2.5 days to get on the boat sitting in the harbor there, and it was a big one. It was bigger than the SS Deutschland. This was the SS George Washington was the U.S. lines, U.S. lines, and I slept on the promenade deck on a cot. The thing was, the embassy had been ordered to tell everybody to get out, and of course this was arranged for me. My Uncle Phil got it all fixed up to come home fast, and he had written me earlier that if I'd gotten trapped over there, he was going to send me to Dublin to go to the University of Dublin. But at any rate, after that, I landed in New York about July 10th, 15th. It took about, I think it took 8 to 10 days on this size ship to cross the Atlantic. Yeah, about 8 to 10 days. And I had to take college entrance because I didn't have the certificate A. And some guy boned me up on, they hired a tutor, and he boned me up on English history, American history, excuse me, sorry. And then I went and I took Latin, and of course I had 4 years of Latin with the Jesuits, so I got, the only 2 tests I took to get into Penn was American history and Latin, and the Latin was like ABC, and so I got into Penn, and then the next spring, my uncle wrote me a letter and said, "Sorry, pal, the money's gone. You're up the creek without a paddle." And he had no money. I mean, he was a banker and he was still going, but he had no, he'd been wiped out and he was paying back his debts. So my brother got me a job as a laborer at the Bethlehem Steel Corporation in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. So in July of 1940, I'm at an exclusive English public school, and in May of 1941, I'm slinging a pick and shovel there. But I got enough money together, and I went back to Penn, and I got a job at a hash house from 7 to 1 6 days a week, for which I've forgotten, I don't think I got any pay, I just think I got food. They gave me 2 meals a day for that. No chops or steaks. It was a nice place to eat, but you eat, but you can have the hamburger plate, but leave the chops and steaks alone. And then I was lucky enough to land a job with the publicity department of the University of Pennsylvania. And my job was to read newspapers and clip out anything having to do with Penn. And I had to read the New York Times, the Herald Tribune, the Daily News of Philadelphia, the Inquirer, the Ledger. And nearly everybody reads the Bulletin and so on. And that got me through my second year. And so I worked my second year through college. And then the next summer, my uncle got me a job in a bank in New York at right up from Macy's, across from the old Pennsylvania Station. And I got restless. I said, this can't do it. They're going to get me anyway. So I enlisted in to become an aviation cadet. And on Thanksgiving Day, I had the choice of waiting in my civilian job to become a cadet, or I could go into the Army as a private, and then when the opening came, I would go become a cadet. I said, well, I've got nothing to do. I'll go in right away. And my first post was Mitchell Field on Long Island. And by and by, that was a dream deal, because every other day we could leave and we'd run into New York, and I knew New York, and it was very, see my relatives and all of that. It was very pleasant in its way. And finally, on Thanksgiving Day, 1942, I was GDO'd, ground duty only. They gave us a test, and I flunked this depth perception test. I didn't hack it. I don't know why they didn't catch it the first time, but that's a long story. But anyway, I was GDO'd, and it took 3 months. I was a supply sergeant at this San Antonio Aviation Cadet Center, Army Air Forces Classification Center. And in our flight, they were called flights, not companies. In our flight, we had Enos Slaughter, who was a very famous baseball player for the St. Louis Cardinals. And that previous year, or that year, the year when I was with him, he came and he was our exercise, he was a sergeant already, and he was the exercise guy, and all he did was play baseball on the baseball team. And when his World Series ring was being given out, the general of the San Antonio Aviation Cadet Center just happened to be going to St. Louis and said he'd take Enos up with him, and he went with Enos so Enos could get his World Series ring. Just a coincidence, of course. And then I got bored to death as a supply sergeant, because all you were doing was handling bedding and taking care of. It wasn't real supplies. I mean, because it was these guys that come in and go out and come in and go out. And I had an opportunity to go to an Army Specialized Training Program, which was a boondoggle device. This is an opinion. They overdrafted. They thought D-Day was going to be 1943. The original plan for D-Day was, this is my opinion, it was 1943, and they overdrafted. They took too many men out of the universities and colleges, and they drained them. And of course, places like Texas, well, it was called the Texas College of Mines and Metallurgy. It's now the University of Texas at El Paso, and Notre Dame University, name it, Boston College, all over the country. These colleges, they had loads of old professors, and they had groundskeepers, and they had guys to do this, that, and the other thing, and they didn't have any students. And somebody dreamed this up. I have a hunch it was Mrs. Roosevelt, but I'm not sure. The idea was they didn't need, they had to get money into the colleges, so they dreamed up a thing they called Army Specialized Training. And I got into it because I wanted to, and you had to give up your stripe. You had to be a private to go into it, but I didn't care. I mean, $78 a month, $50 a month, what's the difference? And we got into it, and then they taught me how to draw a map, a real map, I mean with depth, you know. In order to do that, they began teaching us calculus. I already had trigonometry. Trig, I'd already had trig, but I never had calculus, and in order to do this work at that time, you had to learn calculus. So they were teaching us calculus, and I was from the Wharton School of Finance and Commerce. It was a nice mix. But I think it was a boondoggle. And then it lasted mostly, for most of the guys in ASTP, I think it lasted, if you were in it a long time, it was 5 or 6 months. But they pumped all this money into the universities to keep them going. It's mostly the plant. You know, they had no money. Where were they going to go? And so they sent these guys in, and then they crashed the program in March. You know, I've heard this a million times, I'm sure. They crashed the program in March of '44, which is, you know, 8-10 weeks before D-Day. And then on D-Day, I remember I was doing KP right here in Abilene. On D-Day, I had KP. And I remember looking out the window of this wooden thing. The flap was up, and it was a beautiful day. And I thank God I wasn't in Normandy very much, because I could visualize what was happening there. And I looked off into the distance, and way over were all these German prisoners of war, stripped to the waist, sunbathing. I thought, what a world we live in. Here the biggest invasion in the history of mankind has taken place, and all of these healthy guys, luckiest guys on earth, and there they were in Abilene, Texas, sunbathing. God. But that's how I got into the Army.
So how did you hear about the ASTP program?
On a bulletin board. Do you want to? I swear I may have it mixed up, because at the end of the war I went to the University of Glasgow in Scotland on the Army as a private. I don't know how I got into these things. Can you imagine it? This is in the biggest, worst war that ever was. I was in the Army for 42 months, and I spent 13 months in university. So the 42 months as a private. I wasn't a general or anything. But at any rate, I read about it on a bulletin board, and I don't know what I think they said you had to have 2 years of college, but I never heard anyone else say that, so I can't remember. But at any rate, I applied for it, and nothing flat, I got there. But I had 2 years of an Ivy League school. That may have helped. I don't know. Penn is Ivy League, and but I had no trouble getting into it. It was just applied for it. Took my stripes off and went to Texas A&M College Station. Is that it?
Yeah.
College Station. I remember arriving there, and we were there one night. I think we were only there one night, and all of us were parceled out to different schools. You know, you go here, you go here, you go here. And I was sent to the Texas College of Mines and Metallurgy, and we got there late at night. They put us, the train went through town then, and they had a little subway thing, no cover over it, but they had a little thing, and right in the center of El Paso, we got off the train and had to climb up these steps to the street, but it wasn't a subway, but it was where the station was a little lower, and we get into the trucks, and Texas Mines is up on a hill. We go up and up and up and up. We get out, and I was assigned my first barracks there for the first 3 months. I slept in the visitors' dressing room of the Sun Bowl, and I happened to be there. This is a funny story. I love this one. the Sun Bowl, of course, was one of the first bowls. And in 1940, if I'm not correct, I think there were only 5 bowls. There were only 5 bowls, and all these, they have 15 or 20 of them now. But the Sun Bowl was one of the first, but it was regional. And in 1940, if you weren't New York, you weren't anything. Everything was New York. Everything, the world centered on that. Like Enos Slaughter would have been a giant if he'd played for New York. Ted Williams, Stan Musial, these guys were terrific. And we all knew they were, but they weren't Joe DiMaggio. They weren't Pee Wee Reese. You know, the New Yorkers, everything was New York, New York. And we were, they had a Sun Bowl. I think the team that played, I don't know who they played, but I think San Angelo team, because of the war and everything, couldn't come from very far, and San Angelo played, and they put up all the barriers and everything for the tickets. And there was a place called Kern Place where there was a watering hole I'd go to all the time to get decent food, because Texas Mines gave us the worst food. I think they gave them 85 cents a day to feed us, and I think they fed us on 15 cents a day because they needed the money. But at any rate, we had to use our little $50 a month to feed ourselves. We go over to Juarez and get steak dinners for 75 cents and stuff, but you couldn't get steak here because it was rationed in the U.S., but we go over to Juarez. But so they were putting up this thing, and I thought, I know what I'm going to do. So I waited until the line was big and long, and then I got into the line, and I come up to the ticket guy, and there was a young guy there that says, "Ticket?" I said, "I don't need a ticket." He says, "What do you mean you don't need a ticket?" I said, "I don't need a ticket." And I said, "Get your supervisor." So, Mr. Smith, so this guy comes over. "Mr. Smith, this guy says he doesn't need a ticket. This soldier says he doesn't need a ticket." I said, "No, I don't need a ticket. I live here. I'm going into my bunk. Lay down." The guy, "Get out of here." So I go in, and we went into the bunk, and then the way we watched the game, there was 2 or 3 of us, we knew how to get up there, and then we got on top of the press box. We lay on top of the press box, which was on the, I don't know which side. But anyway, the new Sun Bowl is just the other side of the old Sun Bowl, and that's how I got to it.
Tell me about your first experience in battle.
The first experience in battle was, oh, you don't want to hear that. Yes, you do. Everything I was, when I joined the 12th Armored, I had taught myself to type because my uncle had bought me a Royal typewriter in 1940 when I went to Penn. He bought me a typewriter to go to Penn. It cost $28. And it was a good typewriter. It was made by Royal. And the reason he bought it for $28 at Macy's because it had accent, aigu, and accent. It was made for the French market. And the French market didn't exist anymore. So Royal dumped them out to get rid of them. And my uncle was always, he must have been a pretty sharp guy, that guy. He bought me this typewriter, and I went and bought a book and taught myself how to type at Penn instead of studying. And I had some I had bad marks the year I didn't work, and then when I had to work, I had pretty good marks. It was and I worked long hours, and it's very funny. But at any rate, when I went into the 12th Armored, some guy spotted that I was a typist, and they put me in the service company of the 56th Armored. And so from March until August, when we were getting ready to, well, maybe September, all I did was type with the service company. And then as we got ready to go overseas, they didn't need a typist that way anymore. So they dumped me into the headquarters company. So just before we leave to go overseas, I've been trained for nothing. I had absolutely no training in anything, nothing. And so Captain Maddox, who was the captain, commanding officer of the 56th Headquarters Company, he turned me into a gopher. And I go for this, go for that, go for the other thing. And so I was a gopher. But I wasn't, I don't know. On the trip over, I was nothing. In other words, I joined the outfit, and then a week or two later, we head for New York. And then we go to New York, and I think we were in New York for about 5 or 10 days, glorious days to me, because I was home, and it was the equivalence of a furlough, for crying out loud. And they gave me a lot of leave, because there was nothing else to do. We were at Nyack, New York, camp, I forgot, Hanks or Yanks or something. And and then on the boat over, there was nothing to do. And this is a true story of, you asked what happened with the first combat experience I had. It's ridiculous. So just before we went into combat, Maddox wanted Terra Franca, who was our half-track driver, to do something else. And he called me in, and the only time I had ever driven a car in my life, what was this, 1941? I'm 21 years old. I've never driven a car in my life, and the only thing I ever drove was a 2.5-ton truck on one of these hilly things they had here in Abilene, and at 2.5 miles an hour, and I made it. And so Maddox says to me, have you ever driven? I said, no. I said, but I'll try. And I guess he said to himself, he really wanted Terry to do something else. I don't know what it was. And Terry had been with him from Camp Campbell. So they were the in group and all of that. And so the next day, I think this was out of Lunaville, but wherever, I'm the half-track driver, and the guys told me how to do it. And we got about, 500, 7,000 yards down the road, and the right tread slipped out from under me, and we're in a ditch. So they go on, and it took us about 20 or 30 minutes for a tanker to come along, and then they hitched it up, and they pulled us out, and we eventually caught up with them. And nothing happened that day. And so, but the captain knew I had put this half-track in the ditch. And so we take off the next day. And by Jove, I did not the same thing, I did worse. I really ditched the thing. It was really, a tanker came along and the tank couldn't pull us up. And they had to get what they called a prime mover. A prime mover was a thing they used to move a tank out of a ditch. With a tank. So it took us about 5 or 6 hours sitting there waiting for the prime mover to come along. And so they finally got us out, and I straggled in and caught up with the guys just about dusk, and they're on the side of a hill. And we pull in, and everybody's furiously shoveling, digging a foxhole. I said, what the heck are you doing that for? Well, that was my first thing. Brum, brum, brum. I started shoveling. That was my first combat. And on that day, too, we had passed, the first combat, we had passed a burning farmhouse. I remember the road went right by the barn, and I remember it was smoldering. And I don't know why or how it had been set on fire, and it was completely gone, and the embers were there, and the smoke, and you could smell the various odors. But that was my first day. But again, it's stupid. It was a funny war.
Did you have any involvement with any of the French civilians?
I don't know whether it's the Englishmen don't like Frenchmen and Frenchmen don't like Englishmen. I don't know. I've never liked the French, although I spent 2 summers in the south of France, but with Americans. You see, the only thing I remember is the Frenchmen in Alsace-Lorraine complaining because we were wearing French uniforms. Of course, they had the first, so-called First French Army was attached to us, a very small unit, and general or something or other. But at any rate, oh, I'm sure they did well, but and all that. But when the French people saw them in our uniforms, there were certain French people, and I didn't like that very much. But I didn't know how to speak French. I had 4 years of French, and I knew nothing about French. French taught with an English accent is atrocious French.
Did you have any involvement with any of the concentration camps?
If you want my honest observation is I never heard, I remember Landsberg, I know all about Hitler being there in there in the 20s and all that. And I vaguely remember we took it, but I never heard a word about the atrocities until years later. Even when after the war, when I came home to the United States, I heard very, very little. I knew they had concentration camps in 1938 and 39 when we'd see these Nazi movies. I mean, you know, American made and ill treatment. But as far as the Holocaust, I was not aware of it personally until 2 or 3 years after the war. And many years ago, I decided to I wanted to study something, I won't say what it was, and I wanted to study what happened, having nothing to do with the war, from 1946 until 1953, let's say. I wanted to study this period, and I decided to go to the library, and I started reading the New York Times starting January 1st, 1946, and, 46. And one thing I found out was that George C. Marshall was in Japan every single solitary day of 1946. The general of the army, he had been sent over there to try and settle the Chiang Kai-shek, Mao Zedong, is it Mao Zedong or the other guy? Mao, no. Who was the big Chinese guy? Mao? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mao, it was Mao. And he came back the first or second week of 1947 and became Secretary of State to supervise the Marshall Plan. But in that study of that book, there were 2 books written by concentration camp inmates. And both books were reviewed by the New York Times, and I read both of them. There may have been more, but I only came across 2. Now, I'm scan reading this paper. I'm talking about 365 days, and the average number of pages in the New York Times back then was, on a Sunday, could be 150, and on a weekday could be 100. Or maybe on a Sunday would be 400. There'd be 150 on a normal day, 60, 70, and then they had 2 sections on a. But at any rate, there was no allusion, there were no outright statements by these concentration people about the Holocaust other than to mention the smokestacks the smoke coming from the. I found it. These were the first books written by people who had been in the concentration camps, and for some, either the reviewer or the writer of the book did not underline the Holocaust to the degree that we now know it was. And I was in the 12th Armored Division, and I never knew of the atrocities at Landberg. I left the division in August of in other words, I was transferred to the 2nd Armored Division after the war. I didn't have enough points to go home, and so I was transferred out, and then I was in the 2nd Armored Division for a couple of weeks, and there was a notice on the board that you could, training within civil, TWCA, I&E, Information and Education, TWCA, Training Within Civilian Agency, You could sign up. That one I know you had to have college. You had to have 2 years of college. And if you had 2 years of college, you could sign up for that. And I signed up for it and got sent to the University of Glasgow to wait to come home, which was the following January. I was only there for 3 or 4 months, did very little studying, had a good time. The Scotch people were great and all that. But as far as the Holocaust goes, I did see thousands of DPs. And being in the rat race, we were the first into every town, village, and hamlet for about 4 or 5 weeks there, being right at the head. My most vivid knowledge is they would always be lined up. All of the DPs would be on one side and all of the Krauts would be on the other side. And these people would all be relatively snappy dressers, well-fed and all of that. These people were bedraggled. And I remember the one town we went into where they, I think it was down near the Alps too. It must have gotten awful cold in winter, but they had this barbed wire shed with a tin roof over it and a gate that locked, and then barbed wire, no walls. I mean, if there was a windy day or rainy, and what I believe they did was they took these people and put them in there at night, and at 8 o'clock in the morning or 6 o'clock in the morning, gave them a bowl of soup or weak soup, to go out and sweep the streets, go pick the potatoes, go do this, because all the men were in the war, and they used these, and that was appalling. That was appalling. But I believe every word I've seen on it. Those concentration camps were brutal. They were brutal. The final solution